February 13, 1542. The air over the Tower Green is thin and cold. A small crowd has been kept deliberately at a distance, the usual clatter of court life muffled as a young woman is led from the Queen's lodgings. She walks with the measured steps of someone who has been rehearsed for this moment. The block waits. The charge is recorded in official papers as treason and adultery. The reason, when shouted in court and carried in dispatches across Europe, lands oddly intimate and achingly modern. She has failed to be the virgin the king demanded. It is a charge that reads less like a legal indictment than like a private grievance made public. That image of the sovereign's bedroom turned into a public tribunal is the thread running through Henry VIII's reign. The Virgin Queen was not always an emblem of piety or national myth. For Henry, virginity could be proof of possession, evidence in a case, and, when it failed to conform to his needs, a pretext for annihilation. The question we follow is simple and stark. How did a monarch's private obsessions come to shape law, church, and the fate of the women closest to him? If you want episodes that pull back the curtain on royal power and scandal, hit subscribe and stay with me. To understand the theater of accusation that plays out on Tower Green, we must begin far from the scaffold, inside the gilded nursery of the Tudor prince. A prince's upbringing, historians argue, is a small book of later deeds. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, the second surviving son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He grew up in a court that insisted on pageantry and performance, where every skill, tilting, hunting, music, was training for display. As a child, he was not pressed into the church as his older brother Arthur had been expected to be. Arthur's early death in 1502 threw Henry into an unexpected trajectory, vaulted from spare son to heir apparent, and then to king in April 1509 at the age of 17. Contemporary descriptions of the young Henry show a boy and then a young man intoxicated with admiration. He loved tournaments and ceremony. He loved being praised. Early chroniclers and later historians note a pattern. Henry thrived in environments where he was adored and where his authority went unchallenged. Traits consistent with later behavior begin to appear. A sense of entitlement to obedience, an insistence on being the center of marital and national narratives, and an intolerance for contradiction. Modern psychologists would hesitate to attach a diagnostic label to a 16th century monarch. Nevertheless, the behavioral threads, narcissistic entitlement, impulsive displays of dominance, sensitivity to slights, are visible in the archival record and in the decisions that followed him into office. Those personal traits collided with a society where women's bodies were instruments of family strategy. Tudor England placed immense value on female chastity. For noble families, a daughter's virginity was not only a matter of honor, but a currency for alliances, dowries, and political leverage. The ideal of the chaste bride, publicly pure, privately obedient, served dynastic ends. To be a queen was to be both a symbol and a bargaining chip. To be a queen who could prove virginity after marriage could confer on a husband the ultimate social proof. He had conquered his bride and therefore secured the family line. But this social logic did not, by itself, explain what happened in Henry's court. It supplied the language and the symbols. Henry supplied the mechanism. Over the course of his reign, he blurred the distinction between a private wound and public law. He demanded not merely that his wives conform to Tudor standards of chastity, but that their fidelity be legible, adjudicatable, and, when necessary, policed by acts of Parliament and the machinery of church and state. The marriage bed thus became political territory. The record offers uncomfortable reminders that the king's supposed right to sexual possession was never purely metaphorical. Contemporary ambassadors wrote home in tones alternately cynical and horrified. Legal documents were retooled to serve personal ends. And a monarch who was legally absolute enough to command the law, if not always morally, came to treat women's bodies as evidence in a case he could win by decree. The transformation accelerated in the opening decades of the 16th century.
Two events, roughly a decade apart, rewired the constitutional and religious architecture of England. First, the so-called Great Matter. Henry's demand, beginning in the late 1520s, to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon because she had formerly been his brother's wife and, in his view, could not lawfully be his wife. Second, the legislative seizure of ecclesiastical authority that followed. The acts which made the king supreme head of the church in England in 1534, and the series of parliamentary instruments, the Acts of Attainder and Proclamations, that allowed Henry to make private grievances into public crimes. When the king's intimate life becomes the source of statutes, precedent, and public execution, private desire transforms into statecraft. It is in this context that the stories of Henry's wives unfold, not as isolated tragedies, but as case studies in a recurring pattern. Each woman's entry into Henry's orbit, her rise or fall, and her eventual fate trace a logic that repeats with grim variations: idealization, conquest, devaluation, disposal. The variable is not always the same. Sometimes obstinacy or misfortune corrals the king's wrath. Sometimes politics dictates mercy. But the script, the performance of possession and the recourse to law, returns again and again. Catherine of Aragon. Loyalty tested, then instrumentalized. Catherine of Aragon was born into the politics of late medieval Iberia on December 16, 1485.
Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, she married Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1501, and, after his untimely death in 1502, was betrothed to his younger brother Henry. Their marriage in 1509 seemed to promise a stabilizing alliance between England and Spain. For much of the next 2 decades, Catherine embodied loyalty and patriotic rectitude. She gave Henry a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. Yet her inability to produce a surviving male heir became the axis around which the later crisis would turn. The so-called Great Matter began to consume Henry in the 1520s. He came to believe, or at least insisted, that his marriage to Catherine was contrary to divine law because she had been his brother's wife. The claim hinged, crucially, on whether Henry's first union with Arthur had been consummated. Catherine maintained that her marriage to Arthur had been unconsummated. She preserved a posture of dignity and piety, insisting on the legitimacy of her marriage to Henry. Contemporary dispatches, most famously the reports of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, chronicle Catherine's resistance and her appeals to Rome. Chapuis's letters are often sympathetic to Catherine and hostile to Anne Boleyn. Historians treat them as both invaluable primary testimony and biased commentary, given his service to Spanish interests. What changed the argument's character was not theology alone, but law. Henry set in motion a legal and political process that reframed his personal failing, his lack of a male heir, and his dissatisfaction with Catherine, into an ecclesiastical and criminal matter. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey initially handled the case, attempting to secure a papal dispensation and later seeking a divorce. When Rome stalled or equivocated, Henry's attention gravitated to domestic solutions. Thomas Cranmer's eventual role, Cranmer, by then Archbishop of Canterbury, was decisive. In 1533, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and Henry married Anne Boleyn shortly thereafter. That declaration did not emerge from neutral theological debate so much as from the king's accumulation of instruments of power. The legal maneuvers around Catherine's marriage were not dry procedural moves. They carried human consequences. Catherine refused to accept the annulment. She was excluded from the inner rituals of court. She was not present at Anne's coronation in June 1533, and her household and court shrank. Contemporary observers recorded her stoicism and piety. A surviving letter or two, her dignified appeals to the Pope and to foreign courts, portray a woman who believed in the sanctity of her marriage and who saw herself as the rightful queen even as the machinery of the state moved against her. It is important to note, as many historians emphasize, that the record here is ambiguous. The particulars of consummation and the precise motives behind papal hesitancy are debated. Some historians stress the sincerity of Henry's theological concerns. Others see convenience and male ego.
One plausible reading is that Henry exploited a genuine theological question for political ends. The need for a male heir and the allure of a younger, more politically useful wife combined so that the king's private desire became a pretext for a constitutional revolution. The Act in Restraint of Appeals of 1533, effectively preventing Catherine from appealing to the Pope, made the appeal to Rome impossible. The subsequent Act of Supremacy in 1534 consolidated the shift. The king declared himself head of the Church of England, displacing papal authority and thereby ensuring that his domestic verdict on marriage would stand. Catherine's fall, then, was not simply personal repudiation. It was the first major test case in which Henry took a private claim to be adjudicated by Parliament and restructured the Church to validate his ruling. She died on January 7, 1536, still refusing to accept the annulment. To many contemporaries and to later observers, she remained the image of steadfast devotion. For Henry, however, the episode demonstrated how effectively he could weaponize both theology and law to convert wounded pride into national policy. But Henry's hunger did not stop with legal victory. The story of Anne Boleyn shows how conquest and statecraft could fold into obsession, and how the king's desire could turn into an engine of fabrication. Anne Boleyn: elevation, obsession, and legal spectacle. Anne Boleyn's arrival as Henry's chosen consort marks the moment when private desire and public transformation became inseparable. She was not a foreign diplomat nor a simple pawn. She arrived at court as a complex figure, intelligent, charismatic, and ambitious. By the late 1520s, Anne had become the focus of Henry's attention. He courted her with the same mixture of theatricality and entitlement that marked his earlier life. In her, he saw both a romantic partner and someone who could help renew and legitimize his reign by providing an heir. Anne's ascent had broader philosophical and political consequences. Her patronage circle fostered reformist religious ideas. She was associated with those in England who favored change in clerical life and in doctrinal matters. Many historians suggest that Anne herself was not primarily a theological radical, but she was willing and instrumental in pressing Henry to sever the final umbilical cord with Rome. The marriage to Anne in 1533 and her elevation to queen did not erase the patterns of possession. If anything, her different temperament amplified the king's need to make her endorsement absolute. She became an emblem of victory over Catherine, an object that confirmed Henry's masculine prowess, his renewed fertility, and his capacity to reorder the church. Yet the script, idealize, possess, devalue, discard, reached its most dramatic and legally theatrical form with Anne. By 1536, the king's favor had cooled. The charges brought against Anne, adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, treason, arrived packaged in juridical language. The indictments were read aloud, witnesses were produced, confessions appeared. Here again, the legal machinery served private ends. Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's chief minister and architect of administrative reform, played a central role in constructing the case against Anne. Contemporary sources, including trial records and ambassadorial reports, suggest that some testimonies were the product of coercion or of the pressures placed upon lower-status defendants. Mark Smeaton, a musician in the Queen's household and a commoner, confessed to sexual relations with Anne in a recorded testimony. Historians note that, as a commoner, he lacked the legal protections that would have made his testimony less easily obtained, and that coercion, whether formal or informal, is certainly possible and remains a contested point in the record. Anne's trial culminated in a swift execution on May 19, 1536. The spectacle functioned as both punishment and political theater, an example to those who would defy the king and a means to clear obstacles to succession and policy. But the rapidity and the nature of the charges raise enduring questions. Many historians believe that the evidence was thin and that some confessions were obtained under pressure. Another interpretation stresses the wider political motive. Anne, who had exercised political influence, had become a liability in a court increasingly managed by Cromwell and by factions favoring other alliances. Again, we must be careful about what the sources can reliably tell us. We do know the dates of the trial and the execution, and the names of the accused: George Boleyn, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton among them. Trial records list the counts. Ambassadorial dispatches, particularly those by Chapuis, offer an imperial perspective that is hostile to Anne and sympathetic to Catherine. The rhetorical turn of the court, the use of charges rooted in private sexual conduct to secure political ends, and the role of parliamentary methods like attainder, used in other trials, demonstrate how personal animus could be transmuted into legal sanction. There is a pattern here worth naming. The king's demand for visible proof of conquest, of a bride who could be publicly read as his sole possession, created a condition where failing to supply that proof became rhetorically treasonous. When the evidence did not align with the king's narrative, the state made evidence align by altering procedure, by applying pressure, and by repackaging private breaches as public crimes. The case of Jane Seymour highlights a different variation on the cycle. Jane Seymour, Mourning and the Paradox of Death as Salvation. Jane Seymour appears in the archival record as the woman who finally produced a male heir and yet died soon after childbirth.
She was not the most flamboyant of Henry's wives. She was known for a quieter temperament, a social style that echoed the older Tudor ideal of obedience. Married to Henry in May 1536, shortly after Anne Boleyn's execution, Jane's primary historic significance derives from Edward's birth on October 12, 1537, and from the Queen's death on October 24, 1537. Henry's reaction to Jane's death is one of the more puzzling episodes in the narrative. Contemporary reports record a king grieving with almost pitiable intensity. His mourning and the retrieval of Jane's corpse to be buried in a place of honor suggests sincere attachment. From a structural perspective, though, Jane's brief time as queen also reveals a pattern: compliance rewarded, divergence punished. Where Anne's political assertiveness became intolerable, Jane's subservience satisfied the king's need for a publicly legible conquest and for a mother to his legitimate son. Jane's life and death complicate any simplistic narrative of Henry's pathology. She was neither executed nor exiled. She was, tragically, taken by childbirth. Her example shows that the virgin conquest logic did not always lead to spectacle and execution. Sometimes, submission, combined with favorable circumstances, could secure temporary safety. But the broader pattern, where the king's favor determined political and legal fortunes, remained intact. Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard illustrate further permutations: annulment by mutual agreement, survival through diplomatic settlement, and, in the case of Catherine Howard, execution amid allegations of past liaisons and present betrayal. Catherine Parr survives as a final example of a queen who mastered the art of courtly survival through careful negotiation and theological prudence. But before we move to those later stories, we need to step back and ask, how did Henry convert a private grievance into public power so effectively? How did legal instruments and religious reconfiguration enable what would otherwise be personal vendettas? The mechanics of conversion: law, church, and the manufacturing of proof. Henry's moves in the 1530s were not merely the machinations of a jealous husband. They were constitutional and administrative innovations that remade the relationship between the crown and the individual. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, and the Act of Supremacy, 1534, rewired the spiritual and legal map. The Pope's authority to adjudicate marital disputes was curtailed. The king's power, legally speaking, became ecclesiastical as well as temporal. Where once the monarch had to negotiate with an external ecclesiastical authority, Henry now had the legal instruments to make marriage and its dissolution a domestic matter. Equally significant was the use of parliamentary procedure to secure personal results.
Bills of attainder could convict without the conventional safeguards of a criminal trial.
Where a common law court required evidence and witnesses, an act of attainder could legislate guilt and punishment in a single stroke. Henry and his ministers, principally Thomas Cromwell, used these tools selectively, turning personal grievances into public crimes with legislative efficiency. Alongside statutory power, the machinery of interrogation and confession provided the raw material for accusations. When Henry needed corroboration, officials produced it. Commoners like Mark Smeaton, without the remedial protections of rank, were particularly vulnerable to coercive testimony. Coercive here understood in its contested historical form: forceful questioning, threats, and the tower of suspicion that could lead witnesses to consent to narratives of guilt they may or may not have believed. Noble defendants had greater protections, but not absolute immunity. The weight of royal will and the swift machinery of attainder could overcome many obstacles. Thomas Cromwell is a crucial figure in this architecture. He was the bureaucratic mastermind who could translate royal displeasure into procedural instruments. Cromwell's reorganization of royal administration created a state apparatus capable of executing the king's will with bureaucratic precision. That same precision made the conversion of private grievance into public statute alarmingly tractable. It is also worth emphasizing that the public spectacle mattered. Trials, executions, and ceremonial annulments were not only legal acts, they were performances. They announced to the nobility, to foreign courts, and to the populace that the king's word carried both spiritual and temporal weight. By staging the adjudication of private morality as public theater, Henry turned the intimate into the foundational. His household affairs became precedents, his jealousies became statutes. Patterns and human costs. If we collect the threads, a pattern becomes visible. The king idealized a woman as the symbol of his conquest. He then sought to institutionalize that conquest through marriage, ceremony, and law. When the symbol failed, through failure to produce a son, through political inconvenience, through perceived infidelity, it was not merely personal disappointment. It was an affront to the public script. The response swung swiftly from devaluation to institutional erasure, annulments, executions, exile, or sidelining. This script did not act in a vacuum. The women who found themselves at its center were constrained by limited options. Catherine of Aragon insisted on her legal marriage. Anne Boleyn sought influence and perhaps reform. Jane Seymour adopted the role that secured temporary favor and produced an heir. Catherine Howard and Anne of Cleves inhabited different survival strategies. Catherine Parr sought religious and political prudence. Agency and victimhood intermingled. Some made choices that were strategic rather than purely submissive. Others had options curtailed by birth, politics, or gendered expectations. Primary sources allow us to see faces through the fog. Chapuis's dispatches provide an indispensable, if partisan, window into court perceptions. Cranmer's records show the procedural steps by which marriage law was manipulated. Trial indictments give the stark, juridical language used against accused queens and courtiers. But the record is uneven. Women's voices survive mostly in fragments, occasional letters, recorded last words, or third-party testimony. When Catherine wrote to the Pope, or when Jane's deathbed is reported by a chaplain, we glimpse the intimate human cost behind the statutes and proclamations. Many hook, but the pattern was not random. Watch how it repeats and mutates with a woman who entered Henry's life determined to be loved and instead became the fulcrum of a national revolution. The transition to Anne Boleyn's full reckoning occurs when private romance becomes national policy. By the time Henry marries Anne in 1533, the king has already reshaped the English church to make that marriage legally possible. But the machinery he assembled to secure his desires would prove as dangerous to him as it was to his wives. Those mechanisms, acts of parliament, the reconfiguration of ecclesiastical courts, the use of coerced testimony, and the manufacturing of public spectacle, would be turned inward again and again. Each trial, each annulment,
Each execution left a mark not only on the individuals involved, but on the constitutional fabric of England. We can trace the consequences in the lives of the women who followed Catherine: Anne's elevation and fall, Jane's ephemeral safety, Anne of Cleves' diplomatic annulment, Catherine Howard's execution on charges of past and present infidelity, Catherine Parr's careful navigation of theological controversy. Each case reveals a variation on the same theme. The tools Henry used, law, spectacle, and the rhetoric of conquest, had a predictable and often ruinous effect on the people who became their instruments. But to say the mechanism worked is not to say the motives were straightforward. Henry's decisions emerged from a tangle of personal griefs, dynastic urgency, political pressures, and cultural expectations about masculinity and ownership. Many historians point to his enduring obsession with male succession. Others emphasize the interplay of factional politics, in which ministers like Cromwell and Wolsey maneuvered for advantage. The marriage bed and the succession were not separate arenas. They were conjoined. For Henry, the king's body and the kingdom's future were inseparable, and any perceived threat to the first was a threat to the second. The story ahead is not merely a litany of accusations and legal instruments.
It is a human drama with institutional consequences. How one man's need to be visibly victorious married with a culture that made virginity political, producing a string of virgin queens claimed, tested, and sometimes discarded. Next, we will follow Anne Boleyn's rise to the throne in closer detail, how a woman who fascinated the king became by turns symbol, reformer, and accused criminal, and then trace how the model of property and proof hardened into law. As we move forward, remember to keep one question in mind. When a sovereign can remake the law to justify his private wrath, what protections remain for those who live at his pleasure? If this pull back the curtain on royal power and gendered violence is the kind of history you want, like and subscribe, and stay for the deep dive on Anne Boleyn, where we'll examine the trial records, the dispatches, and the methods by which evidence was produced and public consent manufactured. By the spring of 1536, the machinery Henry had built to convert private preference into public law had reached full throttle. Anne Boleyn, once the catalyst of constitutional revolution, the woman whose attraction had helped break England from Rome, found herself the object of that same machinery turned inward. The king's hunger for a legitimate male heir had set off a chain of events that remade the church and the state. When the heir did not arrive in the way he expected, the state remade her. Anne's rise had been meteoric. Contemporary observers recorded her sharpness, wit, and the confidence that made courtiers either adore or resent her. She arrived at the center of a court convulsed by faction and reform. Her circle included men who favored religious change, and her influence nudged policy in directions that disturbed conservatives. But where her public role mattered most was in what she symbolized: a triumph over Catherine of Aragon, and for Henry, a renewed sense of masculine conquest. For a time, she stood as living proof that the king's will could reorder both church and domestic life. The record of Anne's downfall is dense with dates and documents. The arrest of several of her attendants and of high-profile courtiers began in April 1536. By May, formal indictments had been prepared. Trial records and contemporary dispatches mark those weeks with a dizzying speed. On May 15th through 17th, 1536, a judicial sequence reached its climax: the trials of the accused men, the quick hearings that led to guilty verdicts, and on May 19, Anne's own execution on Tower Green. Primary documents, the court indictments, the surviving letters of foreign ambassadors such as Eustace Chapwis, and extracts from the trial minutes provide the skeleton of events. Yet the flesh of motive and the texture of truth remain contested. What the papers record is stark. Anne was accused of adultery and incest with her brother, charges that in Tudor rhetoric equaled treason because they supposedly endangered the line of succession. Several men, George Boleyn, her brother, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton, were named as co-conspirators. Mark Smeaton's confession, recorded in contemporary accounts, often occupies the most charged space in scholarly debates precisely because he was a commoner, a musician in the royal household,
and therefore legally vulnerable. As a commoner, Smeaton lacked the conventional safeguards of rank. When interrogations intensified, historians caution us to treat his statements as possibly coerced or produced under pressure. The record does not settle the question of coercion, but the context makes the possibility plausible. Contemporary dispatches, most notably Chapuis's, paint the scene in emphatic terms: accusations, rumors, pressure, and the urgency of a monarch who would not be denied vindication. Thomas Cromwell's bureaucratic apparatus amplified this urgency into procedure. Cromwell, who had engineered much of Henry's administrative reformation, now functioned as the principal executor of the king's will. Many historians argue that Cromwell's capacity to generate documentary evidence, to marshal witnesses, and to push through indictments made him indispensable and feared. Whether Cromwell sought to protect the king, to secure his own position, or to eliminate a political rival is a matter of interpretation. The archive supports multiple readings. What is clear is that bureaucratic competence, counsel, interrogation, the production of witnesses, could be mobilized to yield the verdict the king required. Anne's trial itself has the quality of theater. The material charges read as personal and humiliating: adultery, incest, conduct unbecoming a queen. The spectacle served a double purpose. It excused a political pivot, removing a queen who had become a liability, and it reaffirmed the king's moral and legal authority. Yet many modern historians view the evidence as thin. The confessions and testimonies that sealed Anne's fate, especially those from lower status witnesses, are now often treated as suspect. The breadth of political interest in her removal, the velocity with which accusations surfaced, and the pattern of using intimate claims as the basis for high treason combine to make a persuasive case that fabrication or pressure played a role. Still, the precise mix of motive, romantic disillusionment, dynastic anxiety, factional maneuvering, remains the subject of scholarly debate. One interpretation is that Anne's political assertiveness and failure to produce a male heir invited a coalition against her. Another is that a jealous monarch, wounded by what he perceived as betrayal, held the power to criminalize the intimate. The aftermath of Anne's execution reveals the paradox Henry operated within. Having pursued a legal and ecclesiastical revolution to make his marriage decisions sovereign, he now used that sovereignty to clear obstacles and remold succession. But the Crown's turn toward arbitrary procedure left a corrosive mark on English constitutional practice. Acts of Parliament, crowned by royal will, could be used to eliminate individuals without the full protections of common law. In those years, the distinction between private grievance and public crime blurred into near indistinction. Jane Smore's story provides a counterpoint, an alternative route through the same pattern. Where Anne had been assertive and politically engaged, Jane presented a different form of fitness for Henry's needs. Married in May 1536, Jane brought a demeanor described by contemporaries as modest and obedient. Her chief significance in the historical record is her role as mother of Henry's long-sought male heir, and her subsequent death in childbirth in October 1537. Edward's birth on October 12, 1537, followed by Jane's death on October 24, presents a cruel symmetry. The king achieved the dynastic proof he sought, but the woman who provided it died. Henry's recorded grief, accounts describe a man struck by intense mourning, complicates any reading that reduces him to a mere instrument of vengeance. The archival testimony about his sorrow is extensive enough that many historians accept his grief as genuine. Yet structurally, Jane's brief queenship underscores the pattern. Conformity to the king's ideal of possession, here realized in motherhood, bought safety, yet only temporarily and at mortal cost. After Jane came a sequence of marriages that illustrated other permutations of the idealize, possess, devalue, discard cycle. Anne of Cleves was a political marriage, arranged in the wake of Henry's need for a Protestant alliance on the continent, and brokered in large part by Cromwell. Contemporary letters and diplomatic correspondence, Cromwell's own dispatches among them, tell of a marriage negotiated on paper and portrait. The famous episode of the king's disappointment on meeting his wife in person, often described in terms of the mismatch between her Holbein portrait and reality, is complex. Some historians believe Henry's reaction was influenced by political discomfort, rumors about his own virility, and factional plotting as much as by any pure notion of physical disappointment. Henry married Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540. By July of that year, the marriage was annulled. The legal mechanism cited was non-consummation and the existence of a pre-contract. Though the record shows this was accomplished through a negotiated, largely diplomatic settlement that left Anne enriched and secure. The annulment of July 9, 1540 spared her execution and transformed her, interestingly, into a queen protector of sorts. She was given a generous settlement and stayed in England as the king's sister by title. Her survival suggests that submission, combined with a political bargain, could convert devaluation into a form of security. The fallout from the Anne of Cleves episode illustrates how quickly the factions around Henry could turn.
Thomas Cromwell, who had championed the match, found himself vulnerable. Within weeks of the annulment, Cromwell's enemies, those who had never trusted the bureaucrat's reforming zeal, maneuvered against him. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was executed. Here is a telling feature of the Tudor court. Competence that translates private desire into public instrumentality is politically dangerous when the outcomes disappoint or the factions shift. Cromwell's fate, falling victim to the same legal and procedural tools he once wielded, demonstrates the volatility of power in an environment where personal preference and governance were inseparable. Next came Catherine Howard, whose fate returned the narrative to the most brutal template. A teenage bride by some accounts, historians usually qualify her age as very young, probably in her late teens. Catherine entered the court in 1540 as a striking contrast to Henry in his late 40s. Contemporary notes suggest she was vivacious, impulsive, and, importantly, vulnerable to older male influences in her early life. Her background included a household where rumors of past liaisons circulated. Investigators later used those rumors and the testimony of witnesses to build a case of prior sexual indiscretions and of alleged adultery with Thomas Culpeper while she was queen. The charges, once again, combined private sexual conduct with constitutional stakes. The queen's behavior was reframed as a threat to royal dignity and to succession. The legal process that condemned Catherine involved testimony from women of her household, intermediary letters, and interrogations of suspected lovers. Francis Derham, accused of being a past lover, and Thomas Culpeper, accused of more recent involvement, were arrested and executed in December 1541. Catherine's own trial culminated in her execution on February 13, 1542, Tower Green again as stage and site. Contemporary accounts and trial records record her pleas, her youth, and her last moments. Some witnesses at the time described a frightened, repentant young woman. Others described a queen who had not been able to escape the consequences of youthful indiscretion compounded by courtly violence. Here, the template repeats with tragic intensity. A woman whose sexual past, or the perception of one, was weaponized to justify elimination when the king's sense of conquest was threatened. Throughout these episodes, the theme reappears. Virginity, or its public proof, was not merely about chastity. It was evidence of ownership. It was evidence of the king's masculine potency. It was a sign of political control. The court operated under a gendered economy where a woman's sexual history could be converted into legal jeopardy. The consequences were not identical in every case. Some queens survived through diplomacy or through negotiation of their roles, but the logic remained. Catherine Parr offers the last instantiation of survival through negotiation. Henry married Catherine Parr in July 1543. She was older than many contemporary brides, experienced in court politics, and adept at theological conversation. Catherine Parr's sagacity lay in her ability to position herself as nurse and teacher to the king, carefully tending his frailties while avoiding direct confrontation on his most dangerous triggers.
She was also a published author. Her devotional work, Prayers or Meditations, issued in 1545, is often noted as the first book published by an English queen, and that fact speaks to her literate agency and her deft use of public piety. Catherine navigated the treacherous waters of doctrinal conflict without provoking royal wrath, and survived Henry's death in 1547. Her example underscored a final point. Women who could repurpose the roles the court expected, subservient companion, moral exemplar, sometimes found the space to survive and even to exercise quiet influence. If we return now to the mechanisms that made such survival precarious, the legal and religious engineering of the 1530s and 1440s stands out. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, had cut the legal cord to Rome for marital disputes by forbidding appeals to papal authority. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared the king supreme head of the Church of England. These statutes did two things at once. They centralized ecclesiastical authority in the crown, and they supplied a legal infrastructure by which the king could render judgment on matters, marriage, legitimacy, clerical discipline, that had previously been external to his reach. Parliament's willingness to enact bills of attainder added a legislative shortcut to punishment. Where traditional common law procedures demanded formal trials and evidentiary standards, a bill of attainder could be used to legislate guilt and sentence without the full protections of the courts. These instruments, statute law, parliamentary action, ecclesiastical recalibration, were not created to persecute individual women, yet they became powerful tools when a monarch chose to wield them for personal ends. Equally important were the practices of interrogation and the production of evidence. Tudor officials relied on depositions, witness statements, and confessions. The status of the witness mattered enormously. Commoners like Mark Smeaton were especially vulnerable, both because their legal protections were limited and because their testimonies were easier to extract and publish. The degree to which coercion or duress shaped such testimonies is contested. Some sources report rough interrogations and severe pressure. In other cases, the record is more ambiguous. Historians therefore often qualify claims about torture and coercion, noting that the legal culture allowed intrusive questioning, and that what today we might call coercion was more easily achieved in a context that blurred custodial interrogation with private pressure. The historian's obligation is to mark those areas as disputed, to point to the documentary trace, and to avoid asserting certainty where the record is ambiguous. Thomas Cromwell's role in all this bears repeating. If Henry supplied the motive and the emotional impetus, Cromwell supplied the procedural means. His administrative reforms, centralizing record-keeping, professionalizing royal bureaucracy, and expanding the reach of government, made possible a modern state that could implement the king's will efficiently. Cromwell's downfall, after Anne of Cleves, suggests another truth. The same apparatus that made order possible could, in factional hands, become a weapon. Bureaucracy in Tudor England was not neutral. It could be harnessed to factional ends, to dynastic aims, and to personal grudges. To read the sequence of marriages as simple pathology is tempting but inadequate. Henry's actions sat at the intersection of personal narcissism, dynastic anxiety, and political calculation. The cultural value attached to virginity supplied the language and the symbolic currency. Legal and religious reforms supplied the instruments. Factional politics supplied motive and opportunity. The women involved exercised constrained agency. Catherine of Aragon chose legal resistance. Anne Boleyn engaged in court politics. Jane Seymour conformed. Anne of Cleves negotiated. Catherine Howard misstepped. Catherine Parr navigated prudently. Each woman's choices and constraints mattered. Each life was shaped by forces both personal and systemic. The consequences, in aggregate, go beyond the body count. Henry's fusion of private desire with sovereign authority altered English governance. The precedent that the monarchy could resolve marital disputes domestically and could use Parliament to remove enemies hardened the idea of royal supremacy. That supremacy carried long-term effects. Law and ceremony moved closer to personal monarchy. Constitutional norms shifted in ways that would later complicate the balance of power between crown and subject. The brutality of public spectacles, executions on Tower Green, the theatrical reading of charges, the parading of accused persons, had a disciplinary function. They taught the nobility and the populace where power ultimately resided. Yet the most striking political inversion after Henry's reign belonged to his daughter Elizabeth. Elizabeth I's virgin queen public persona must be understood in part as a deliberate uncoupling of private intimacy from public sovereignty. Where Henry had weaponized virginity as evidence of male conquest, Elizabeth performed a different ritual. She claimed chastity as her political virtue, using the rhetoric of virginity to suggest that England itself was her spouse and that she would not be subsumed by a husband's authority. In that rhetorical inversion, virginity becomes armor rather than proof of possession.
Elizabeth's cultivated single status, her famous refusal to marry foreign princes or English nobles, served to place her authority above the domestic claim to ownership. It made marriage a potential threat to the political order rather than a necessary dynastic tool. Elizabeth's strategy did not erase the legacy of Henry's reign. The institutions Henry reshaped, particularly the royal supremacy over the church, remained in place. But she repurposed symbols of chastity, turning the concept into a public performance of sovereignty. Where her father had used intimate proof to control women, she used symbolic chastity to neutralize the claim that a husband could appropriate power. It was a subtle but decisive cultural and political counterpoint. When we survey the human ledger, the lives interrupted, the reputations ruined, the executions and the quiet survivals, the cost is unmistakable. Women were the instruments and victims of a system that treated bodies and sexual reputations as political evidence. It is tempting to reduce the story to a single villain, yet the fuller truth is a network. Henry's personality and desires, the cultural logic of chastity as property, the legal innovations that centralized ecclesiastical power, the administrative capacity to manufacture testimony, and the factional struggles that turned procedure into poison. The result was a reign in which private grievances found a legislative echo and where the personal became formative of public institution. What then are the moral and historical takeaways? First, institutional structures matter. When law and religion are designed to answer the sovereign's private questions, the risk of abuse is heightened. Second, cultural values, here the commodification of female chastity, can be weaponized by those in power. They are not neutral. Third, individual agency existed but was deeply constrained. To call the women of Henry's life mere victims understates their navigations, but to call them fully autonomous agents misreads the limits they faced. Finally, symbolic inversion can rewire power. Elizabeth's appropriation of virginity as political stewardship shows how a cultural sign can be reclaimed and reoriented. We end where we began, on Tower Green. The quiet of that open space, the ritual of the scaffold, the finality of a blade, they are the visible, clearest reminders of how private obsession can become public sentence. When the sovereign's bedroom becomes a courtroom, when virginity is given legal force, and when Parliament is asked to confirm a monarch's private grievance, the cost is not merely individual sorrow, but constitutional change. The virgin queens of Henry's reign were produced by a confluence of cultural assumptions and political innovations. Some were claimed and discarded, some negotiated survival, and some died under the weight of a system that made their bodies into evidence. It is worth pausing to remember the human details that survived the institutional machinery. Catherine of Aragon, dignified to the end and writing letters to Rome; Anne Boleyn, intelligent and politically engaged, summarizing both reform and romantic danger; Jane Seymour, a mother who died at the moment of delivering the dynastic proof; Anne of Cleves, who traded queenship for a secure place in England through pragmatic negotiation; Catherine Howard, a young woman whose youthful choices were turned into cause for execution; Catherine Parr, an intelligent survivor who wrote and counseled in the king's last years. Each name is a life at the intersection of private longing and public law. One final thought. Historical interpretation is an act of reading the fragmentary, of balancing documents, dispatches, and material traces against the human impulse to narrate. Where the record is ambiguous, scholars have proposed different accounts.
some stressing Henry's sincere anxiety about succession, others foregrounding his narcissism and penchant for possession, some emphasizing factional politics, others highlighting religious transformation. All these elements are part of the picture. What unites them is the unsettling truth contained in the title we began with. In Henry VIII's reign, virginity became more than a private virtue. It became a political instrument, a currency of possession, and for too many women, a matter of life and death. The Tower Green image returns, a monarch who turned the domestic into statute, a series of women who bore the consequences, and a polity that would carry those precedents forward long after the king's death. Elizabeth's later staging of chastity as power suggests one route out of the trap Henry laid, yet the scars remain in legal and cultural memory. To read the sequence of marriages as a mere succession of scandals is to miss the larger lesson. When private possessive instincts find legislative form, they reshape public life. If you want a full, document-based deep dive into the trial records, ambassadorial dispatches, and administrative papers that underlie this narrative, especially the Anne Boleyn trial and the parliamentary acts that made the great matter possible, watch our companion episode on Anne Boleyn, The Trial. If this unmasking of Tudor power and gendered violence mattered to you, like and subscribe, and share this with someone who cares about how private desire can become public law.